Hand reading skills are essential in figuring out how much your river bet should be, or even if it would make more sense to check the river. Having an idea as to what your opponent might have will allow you to gauge how much they're willing to call when you're looking to make a value bet, or even how small of a bet you can make as a bluff when you think your opponent might have missed a draw. In situations where you put your opponent on a missed draw, if you plan on bluffing the hand, your bet size should be on the smaller side. In case you're wrong, and if your opponent wasn't on a draw, there's no need to lose more chips than necessary with your bluff. Okay, let's take a look at an example. All right, blinds are 15-100. You raise to 250 in late position with pocket fours. In the small blind, he calls. The flop comes 8-9-9 with two hearts. The blind checks and you bet 400. Your opponent calls. Okay, the turn card, king of clubs. Your opponent checks once again, and you decide to take one more stab at the pot in case your opponent is drawing, so you go ahead and bet 650. Your opponent calls, and you put him on either a flush draw or some kind of straight draw like Jack 10. In this scenario, you normally would have to put in your last bet on the turn, unless a 4 hits the river, in which case you'd make another value bet with a full house. However, the river card is an 8. Now that counterfeits your pair, and it leaves you playing the board. Your opponent checks to you, and you decide that it's very likely he's also playing the board, and a bet here could steal half of the pot. There's 2 pair on board with a king, so there's 2,700 in this pot, and if your opponent has the type of hand you put him on, a big bet simply isn't necessary. I mean, he's hard-pressed to call you with the board on the river, knowing that his best-case scenario is a split pot. Virtually any bet will win you this pot if your read is correct, but you don't want to make the bet smaller than your turn bet, as it may be too enticing for your opponent to call. Also, with a slightly bigger bet than your turn bet, you may force your opponent off ace-high as well, in case he had an ace-high flush draw. A bet of about 800, that should do the trick. A bet that size, it looks like a legitimate value bet, but at the same time, it's small enough so that when you are wrong, the damage to your stack is minimal. Now, what if that scenario was slightly different in that all the details are the same, you still figure your opponent for the flush, but this time you actually have ace-9 for a full house? This might be a good time to make what may appear to be a goofy bet of, say, 400. Okay? For 400, your opponent might just call you with the board thinking that he's getting a good price on the call. Better still, he may see your goofy bet as a sign of weakness and go for a bluff check raise. As I mentioned previously, gauging when it's appropriate to make a goofy-looking bet like this one depends heavily on the type of hand you put your opponent on, okay? If you feel as though your opponent might have an 8 or a king or is just the type of player that always thinks you're bluffing, a bigger value bet would definitely be in order. Against a player like that in this scenario, you'd be better off with a bet of like 1,200 to 1,400. The best players in the world are all very good at recognizing situations on the river where checking is better than folding, and also using their hand reading skills to come up with a bet that makes the most sense based on what they think their opponent has. That skill, figuring out your opponent's hand, is the most important factor in deciding how much to bet on the river, or whether it makes sense to check. Okay? Poker isn't as simple as, well, I have the top full house and want full value, so I might as well just bet it all. Approaching your decisions that way will make you lose out on opportunities to gain a little extra value here and there when a smaller bet might get called. With blinds at 25-50, a player limps in from early position and you limp in from late position with pocket eights. Both the blinds call. The flop comes Jack 10-4 with 2 hearts. All players check to you and you decide to bet 150 to test the waters. Blinds fold, limper calls. The turn is a 10 of diamonds, and once again, your opponent checks to you. At this point, your read tells you that his most likely hand is a draw, so you decide to bet again, 375 this time, and he calls. The river, the 6 of diamonds, and your opponent checks. At this point, you figure that your 8's are the best hand. How you proceed on the river, though, is completely reliant on your read of your opponent. If you have no read at all, the safest and most logical play is to check and hope that he missed his draw. Things change a little bit when we have some information on our opponent. For example, if we know our opponent is tricky, we should definitely check the river. If our opponent plays his hands meekly, we should also check the river because he might be checking a jack. If our opponent thinks we bluff too much and may be betting a busted draw, we should value bet the 8s. A bet of 500 may get called by a hand as weak as ace-high in this situation. If your opponent had, say, 6-7 of hearts, he's also very likely to call your bet with his pair. So, as you can see, your decision as to whether a bet makes sense or not is entirely dependent on your read of your opponent. Let's take a look at another example. A player under the gun raised 600, blinds are 1 and 2. You look down at aces from the small blind, and you make it 2,100. Your opponent calls, and that leaves you with like 45,000 in chips. Your opponent, he's got 85,000. The flop comes 3-3-7. With 4,400 in the pot, you decide to bet 2,500, which, could look like you are either making a continuation bet with ace-king, or you actually have the goods. Your opponent calls. At this point, it looks like your opponent has a strong hand. Okay? A, he raised under the gun. B, he called the re-raise. And C, he called you on a totally ragged board. It looks like he has a high pair. Okay? The turn is a deuce, and there's now 9,400 in the pot. On the turn, you decide to bet 5,500, and your opponent calls again, building the pot to a little over 20,000, and leaving you with still 37,000 left in chips for the river. Now, the river comes to 3, giving you a full house, and now it's time to decide how much to bet. Before you do that, though, you must first go over what it is you know about the hand and think about your read on your opponent's playing style. Okay? What we know. All right? First of all, his hand has to be strong to call you on the flop and the turn. Right? It looks very much like he's got a big pocket pair. What we need to figure out, is this player capable of making a big laydown if we bet too much? Will this player think we may be running a bluff? Is there any chance we're beat? Finally, what's the most he will call without making him feel like it's going to hurt too much? Okay? Against a typical opponent, one that is likely to pay you off with kings, queens, or jacks, and maybe even 10s through 8s, a big bet is in order on the river. Okay? With 20,400 in the pot, a bet like 17,000 would definitely make sense, leaving us with 20,000 behind. Betting that amount could possibly even sway your opponent into thinking you bet 17,000, because you want to save that 20,000 left in case your bluff doesn't work. The reason a big bet is not only appropriate, but should also work in this case is because of what we know. Our opponent's hand has to be strong. Okay? If we didn't think our opponent was very strong, we'd have to lower our asking price accordingly. Okay, now, with blinds at 1 and 200, you raise from middle position with ace-7 of clubs to 500, and the big blind calls you. Flop comes. Queen, 7-4 with 2 hearts, and your opponent decides to bet 800. Okay, still unsure where your opponent is, you decide to take the safe approach and just call with middle pair. The turn's a deuce of clubs, giving you a backdoor flush draw, along with your pair of 7s. Okay? Now this time, your opponent bets 1,800, and now you're starting to suspect that he has a hand like queen-jack or king-queen, so, well, you obviously just call. The river is the ace of hearts. Not exactly the card you were pulling for, but still a good card, as now you have aces up. That card also brought the flush with it, so that might scare your opponent also. There's 6,300 in the pot, and both you and your opponent have 30,000 chips left. Your opponent checks, and it's up to you. Okay, what we know. It appears our opponent has something like a pair of queens. We can't be sure about that, but that's what it looks like based on the play of the hand. All right? What we need to figure out, is it likely that our opponent has us beat? If so, we check, but that seems really weak, and it's unlikely he flopped a set, made a flush, or made aces and queens and just checked. Is this player the type that pays off big bets, or would a big bet scare him off? For most players, a bet that's too big will scare an opponent away, even if they're suspicious. What else? What does this player put me on? Okay, that's always important. What is the most I can bet where my opponent feels forced to pay me off? Would my opponent go for the check raise if he made the flush? If that's the case, then you don't want to bet too much either. Pick a number from 2,000 to 2,600, maybe like 2,200, okay? And this gives yourself a chance to get called if your opponent happens to put you on the straight draw 5-6 or something. It's a long shot to get paid off, but a bigger bet than that will minimize your profit long term against most players. By betting about a third of the pot size, you may convince a player to make a pot odds call, even though he thinks he's probably beat. You'd be surprised how often players will find a way to justify making a long shot call on the river when the pots get bigger. As these examples show, figuring out the right river bet is heavily dependent on your hand and people reading skills. The better you become at that aspect of the game, the better you'll be able to play tricky situations on the river. You simply can't have any success in deep stack no-limit hold'em games unless you develop this part of your game to the point where it becomes, well, relatively easy.